Hi, I'm Bethany Auk. I'm the founder and creative director of SlideRabbit, which is a presentation services and training agency. Welcome to the second installment of our webinar series, Sweet Slides 101, which covers crucial presentation-related skills. Subscribe here to catch more presentation-related content or follow us on LinkedIn to catch the next session live. So today's session is our second session, From Numbers to Narrative, and today we'll focus on how we can start with a set of unwieldy data and end with effective and persuasive graphs. Firstly, let me just say that if you're intimidated by data, you are not alone. 75% of professionals would agree with you. In fact, only a small subsection of professionals really feel confident in their data skills. But we know that data skills are crucial. Almost every business decision these days is made by data-driven analysis. So it comes to reason that, of course, having great data skills at work correlates with individual performance. In fact, 85% of data literate employees rate themselves as performing very well at work, but only 54% of the greater population would say the same. So I've worked with many teams that are attempting to hone their data skills, and today we'll walk through some of the skill sets that we teach with real but anonymized data sets. As we go, again, please use that question and answer panel if things occur to you, and pop ideas in chat as we walk through. So believe it or not, this is a set of finished data slides that was shared with me. This team was sharing this raw data with leadership in order to illustrate the different performances at different lodging areas. Have you seen slides like this? Have you showed them? As presenters, when we ask an audience to process something like this, we're effectively handing over our job. We're not processing and analyzing the numbers. And so we're giving up our chance to have the effect and influence over our data. If we want our data to be immediately effective and persuasive, we need to turn it into something that can be processed more quickly, something that makes our points immediately clear to the audience. So when I discuss with leadership the goal for this department, you'll be shocked at how much simpler the graphs make it to understand important information. And we'll take a look at those in a second. But I just wanted to point out that our brains can process images in just 13 milliseconds, according to MIT. So if we can massage our data into visual input, our audience can understand it more directly and immediately. Our brains are made to process visual information. It's built right in, whereas mathematics and calculations are learned. So here are the graphs that leadership was looking for out of all that granular data, from 4 impossible to process data table slides into one succinct set of graphs. What this shows us is if we put some effort into analyzation and interpretation of our data, we can become better data communicators because our data is now in visual input, which is much more immediate for our audience to process. We need to do some of the work so that our insights and conclusions can be easily perceived and therefore they can be persuasive. So by working to understand our own data and then converting it to visual input, we can be great data communicators. So here's the side-by-side, right? We must recognize that just having the data isn't enough. We need to be able to understand and communicate it in a way that aids to understanding and reveals our insights. So how do we get from here to there? Today, we'll learn how to get from here to there, and we'll start with essentially 4 major steps to the data story journey. First, we want to learn how to read and analyze our data tables. How do we get familiar with the data that we're working with? Next, how do we identify what insights it's appropriate to share? Then we'll talk about effective graphing, turning those insights into visual communication. And finally, we'll discuss how does data become story? All right, so that means we have to start at the beginning with the data table. So here, I'll give you a second to read this slide and let me know what you see here. Pop that in the chat. What do you see in the data table? What do we have here to work with? We'll be using this data today. I've selected something a little less overwhelming so we could get through it. What do we see in the data table? What items do we have to work with when we're working with creating insights and creating visual input from this data. Okay, so Bill Chan's already digging in. He's seeing that some of the categories or the dispositions, which is essentially the same thing, are common across the different years, which means we also have years to work with right here. We've got numbers, results, and we've got percentages, right? So let's take a look. All right, so we've got categories, which I mentioned is kind of the same as dispositions. Essentially, what we're doing here is taking all of the calls that came into their call center and categorizing them to see which issues are causing the most calls. Of course, we've also got 2 years of data to work with. We've got our absolute numbers, the exact number of the phone calls that came through. And then, as we mentioned in the chat, we also have the percentages, which talks about the composition of the full call volume and which call topics caused the most calls. So when we just look at this data again, we should ask ourselves, what questions can we answer with this data? And I saw some of those rolling through the chat. So I've marked some of these down. So what we can answer is, we know that we're talking total call volume year over year. And we can do that by category, or we can do that in total call volume. What are the changes in each category between the 2 years? Which categories are causing the most and the least phone calls? And where are calls increasing or decreasing between the 2 years? So that's a lot of stories that we could tell here, and we can't tell them all. That would make it really impossible for our audience to process all of the information and walk away with some action items and takeaways. So we have to be a little bit selective. If you've been to any of my webinars or trainings before, you know that I like to talk about respecting cognitive load. When we're learning new information, we're doing that in the working memory. But essentially, the working memory has limited capacity and duration. So we have to be selective about what we share so that we can be sure our audience is taking as much of what we find important with them. If we give them too much, what happens is we just cause overload, and potentially they could be just discarding newer information or even information that we think is more important. And we don't want to lose control of what our audience is taking away. That's kind of our worst case scenario. We want to keep control of how they perceive the data and how they react to it, and where the action items might take them. So in order to do that, we have to be purposeful and selective with what we highlight when we're working with data, and avoid making the audience's head spin with too many stories. Okay, so now that we've kind of walked through getting familiar with data, we should talk about where now do we find relevant insights. When we're tasked with new data review, we need to ask ourselves, do we have a question that we're answering? Perhaps we're evaluating marketing results and making a directional decision on next year's strategy, or maybe we're reviewing success metrics, seeing where we might need to allocate better resources to hit some goals, or we're reviewing year-over-year revenue across departments, and budgeting decisions will flow from that data. Data doesn't happen in a vacuum, so we need to make sure to consider the questions that need to be answered. So pop it in chat. Based on the context that we see and the stories that we discussed, what business question are we trying to answer right now? What are we asking? Any ideas? Yes, areas that need improvement, right? So we're going to see them starting to roll now into the chat. Yes, based on our title, we can infer that we need to give our audience the information they need to identify potential areas for improvement. So from there, we can then look for certain things within our data. And some of these things might be, patterns that are emerging in the data, trends up or down over time, correlation, which we know doesn't mean causation, but it might mean that that a little bit more analysis might reveal something very interesting. Cycles in our revenue, seasonality, or other sorts of cycles. Variations from the norm, unexpected blips in data. What caused that, right? We want to be inquisitive with our data. Maybe we're checking for alignment with the industry or our peers. Are we tracking against them appropriately? And then, of course, any sudden changes. Something might be wrong, or it might be right. So by asking ourselves, what is the business question? And then evaluating the data with a little bit of curiosity, looking for some of these items, we can come closer to figuring out what insights we need to be communicating to our leadership or whoever, maybe it's a client. But whoever it is, the next thing we need to do is really change our focus. In order to simplify the story enough so that it can be powerful, we need to stop thinking about everything that we know with all the details and the caveats and all of this other data that's available to us, and instead start thinking only about what the audience needs or wants to know to make the conclusions or decisions that they need. Think back to this example, right? The audience can't know everything. It's going to cause overwhelm and make takeaways nearly impossible. So by doing some of the work for them, we can create that moment of understanding during the presentation or the review of the visual data expressions. Again, change that lens and focus on what information your audience needs or wants to know. Now that we know what we're trying to answer, we can start to think about how we can present that data visually. So I want to just talk through a couple of different graph types because there are different graph types for different use cases. This is just a few of them that I'll go through today. But for instance, here are the types of graphs that help us examine composition, percentages, the makeup of different categories. On the left, we see some graphs that examine changes in composition over time, where we can have our categories be different time periods. On the right, we're looking more at kind of snapshots in time. Other types of graphs make it easier to compare data. When there are many variables, you'll see that data table is popping up there because it may be necessary. But if we're simplifying to tell that simple story and avoid overload, we can look for graph types that make things visual and more immediately accessible to the audience. And then I should also mention relationship graphs, where we're examining the relationship between variables, and those will usually appear in scatter charts or bubble charts. Okay, so here again is our data. And we know we are looking for to make areas for improvement clear. So any idea on the graph types? What might we use given the data that we have? A slope. Bar chart comparing year over year. We've got a lot of good ideas. Pies, because we have composition. Great. So let's take a look at some of these. Let's go first. A dumbbell dot plot. Ooh, we're getting crazy. I like it. Let's start first. Let's just talk about pies and donuts here. So in these charts, we can see the composition by the disposition or the category of calls for each year. We can see pretty well the snapshot from year to year for each year, excuse me. So that we can see the composition of each year, but as humans, we are not great at calculating area. So asking an audience to compare slices from one pie or donut to another gets a little sticky. It's not easy for us to see where there were increases or decreases through the year. Let's see. I think I have some. There we go. So we can see the composition easily. We can see each year's composition nicely, but we're having a hard time comparing, again, because we can't calculate those slices visually quite as easily. And given that we have this legend and all these little colors down at the bottom, it can be a little hard to review. This is a situation where we might want to do some direct labeling, but again, with two pie charts, one for each year, we have a little bit of trouble kind of being succinct with that because there's a legend that needs to apply to two graphs. So usually I will pause right here just for a hidden tip or trick. We are going to go through more graph types, but usually in my workshop, the second I take the data table away, someone will say, if I don't have the data, the actual data on the slide, someone will ask about it and I'll be kind of up there with my, pants down. So I just want to share a tip and trick. So you see when I roll over my slide, see that how my cursor turns to a little click indicator hand? What I've done there is just hide a link to a hidden slide. So this slide wouldn't have come up in my normal march of slides. But because I've hidden that link, I can get to it immediately. And that way I can hide the data table within reach. So if, that one guy or gal who always asks a click down from what you prepared, you can still feel prepared and still, you can both feel prepared and still feel like a great visual presenter by using some hidden data tricks. So that's a link to a hidden slide. You could just put a link then back to the original slide, or notes pages are always great if you're looking to generate a handout afterwards. Okay, so let's just jump quickly back to our pie chart. So there were some benefits here, right? We could see the composition easily. Another option to a pie chart is a stacked bar chart. Now, these are both showing composition, but we have the added benefit of seeing the increase year over year. So we can easily compare these two sets of data. Now, because the colors are kind of closer to each other in space rather than being on two separate donut circles, we have an easier time comparing the length of, say, like the second blue there across the years. We are better at calculating length visually than we are area. So this is an easier way for people to be kind of immediately connect with the content and what the data is saying. But again, we're still using that legend. So we have a lot of categories down here. Another option would be to direct label on here, meaning putting each name of the disposition right by the slice of the color through these charts. But again, so many categories, we might be getting a little messy going in that direction. So what about a stacked bar chart by category? So now I've split each disposition or category into its own graph, and we can still see the composition because the higher volume categories are gathered at the top. But now we can also make some very easy comparisons. Each disposition can use more length across the slide, and so now we can see even the smaller differences more clearly. The review is also easier, right? We can even see these small categories down here, see where the changes were there. Okay, so the question I like to ask now, though, is, am I emphasizing the right things? Currently, the way the graph is set up, we're showing combined volume over 2 years. We have the color differentiation, so you can tell year 1 versus year 2, but the way that the kind of full length of the bar is showing is emphasizing full volume with the 2 years combined. So we can see things where they've increased or decreased, but we're not really set up to do that analysis quickly. So if we wanted to make sure that those increases and decreases within categories from year to year, we could potentially switch to something like this. Now we can quite easily see where things have changed from year to year. The audience can easily run their eye down the graph lines and see where things have changed from year over year. We've covered some nice spaces in this graph, right? We can see the composition like we could with the previous option, but we also now have this added ability to see how the different dispositions are behaving. So this is really a true data expression from the graph that we started with, but it's still not a story, and that's what we'll get into next. A quick mention of slope graphs, because I did see that roll in the chat. A slope graph, if you're not familiar with it, is wonderful. It's a line graph, and it's essentially a line graph with 2 data points, which is what we have here. We have 2 years. So this could be an option. The danger with these is that it would be a little bit difficult to list all of the dispositions, and it's definitely worth a try, but because of the height differential of the slide, it might be a little difficult. I do like the slope graph option, though. I wish I'd prepared one for today. Okay, so we have our data expression, but we know we need to tell a story. To be a clear and effective data communicator, it's not enough just to show that snapshot. We need context, right? We need to craft a narrative around your data with relevant information. We need the what and the why and the how. But it's so important to remember to be selective here. If we share everything, we risk creating overwhelm. So we want to make sure that we are sharing only the most crucial what, whys, and hows, so that we're not kind of like belaboring the point as far as all of the context. But context really isn't enough to make it a data story. What we really need is to close out our data story with a so what. What action or change should this data inspire in your audience? Is it a motivator, an indicator, a problem, or a hint at a solution? Provide clear, actionable recommendations based on your insights and make sure these recommendations are feasible and aligned with the business goals. So let's see what we have here. Here's our snapshot again of what happened. What about the why or the how? We lack a little bit of context. Here's some important context for this data. I've added a subtitle that relates to COVID. In these years, obviously, travel changes were very common because of COVID-related travel issues. So I'm adding it, to the subhead for our purposes. It might be better mentioned in the talk track. Another option might be to move this context to an annotation and use spatial relations, right? Putting stuff that applies to each other near each other. It's very clear to our audience. So we'll relate it directly to the data point with which we think it had them, or on which we think it had the most effect. And this helps explain one of our outliers. So now we can focus on the so what of the general business question. If you remember, we were looking for areas for improvement. So give some thought to what the goal of the data review might be, right? We know we have the business question, and we know that might cause a change in direction or some ideas on investment, resources, or headcount. So keep in mind what you want your audience to do or see in the data, what we want them to do as a result of what we're sharing with them. We can provide the necessary elements to close out our story to an action item. And to do that, I like to think of creating traction. Once you've found your so what, think about creating traction for that target action. If we're gaining traction, we're gaining progress and momentum in the direction that we want. So what is traction? Traction breaks down into some of the elements that we can add to our data expression to add in that so what. The first might be a really helpful title. Recommendations based on our insights that we found in the data. Annotations for important outliers or context information, which we just saw in the last slide. Conclusions that flow from the data, and potentially most important, takeaways. Now that we've learned the conclusion from the data, what is the next action or learning to take with us and act upon? Not only should our data be visual and easy to process, but we should be clear and direct with what the data means and how we want the audience to react to it. So this might be the time to how to success, right? And then we want to draw the audience's, maybe leadership's or clients' eye to the successful numbers that we've hit, the outperformances that we've done. Or maybe we need to draw attention to a need where we could use more resources or training. But either way, we need to really make that clear when we present the data. Okay. So now that we know our traction action items, what might our conclusion that we want to draw the leadership's attention to be given our data? Great. So yes, we have some suggestions that the highest volume categories could be targets for improvements, right? 3 big areas for improvement. Right. Awesome. Exactly. So we know here that our top 3 dispositions, this is where we're spending a lot of time at the call center, and that means we're spending a lot of money at the call center. So we're answering these questions over and over again. So let's use one of our traction pieces of strategy here and annotate them. One way to do that might be to add emphasis to the important categories and de-emphasize the others just by simply turning them gray. That way we're making it clear for the audience, and we're not hiding other data. We have some good context for just how high these dispositions are, in our call volume. Even in our first year before COVID really started affecting our call center, we were still seeing these as the three top volume causers at the call center. What else from our attraction list could we include? Right? Let's take a look at this title, right? We're making an implication, but instead we could be making a conclusion in our title. We want our titles to be powerful. They're the biggest text on our slide, so we should be making use of them in order to kind of drive our points home. Okay, so what I've done there is I've just changed it to, and this might be, again, vacuum doesn't happen in, data doesn't happen in a vacuum. So this may be a different conclusion depending on how this business operates. But one option would be website improvements could alleviate call volume. A great booking website could potentially handle all three of these and alleviate some of that call center volume. So now we're giving our audience what happened and why, but most importantly, what we should do as a result. So here's the before and after. You can see that we've gone from a set of data with very little context and no obvious action items to an easy to process visual that gives lots of context and also a recommendation or a takeaway, right? We've given them the so what, that all important so what. We'll have a second for question and answer shortly. So pop those in Q&A if you haven't already. I see a few in there. Remember, we may have missed them in chat. But first, let's quickly review what we learned today. First up, when it comes to telling a great data story, we need to review our data for understanding. Get in there, get familiar with what you have to work with. Once you've identified all of the questions that your data can answer, compare those questions to the business question at hand and to the context your audience needs to zero in on what we need to be sharing. Then select a graph type that allows your audience to see what you see in the data. So evaluate your own graph type to make sure it's easy and to spot that right conclusion and that it's doing the hardest work. It may take a couple graph types until you get kind of more facile with graphing to figure out how we're going to kind of draw the eye to what we really need to see. And then finally, provide that what, why, and how, but also, so importantly, provide that so what. What should happen next based on the insights that you're sharing? Our next session was heavily requested in our survey results. Captivate and Engage will tackle skills to keep your audience hooked, from strong openings and narratives to also design tricks that will capture and hold attention. Audrey will pop that link in the chat, so we'll hope to see you in October. Okay, great. Oh, and then quickly before we get to Q&A, if you do want to keep up with these sessions and you don't already, follow us on YouTube or LinkedIn. LinkedIn is where we announce each session. We also have a newsletter that will announce each session. Okay, so question and answer. Audrey, did we have anything in question and answer, or did you receive any questions that we should discuss?
Yeah, we have one from Anne. Do you typically have to recreate data into visuals by hand? For example, when you don't have the original data in a spreadsheet, any tips for doing this quickly and accurately?
Yes, if you don't have the data in a spreadsheet, it can be kind of laborious to go through. And really, if you've received it, maybe it's already in a different graph type or it's in like an image of a spreadsheet. There are some tools online that will OCR data, and OCR is like automatic. I don't remember the exact what it stands for, but essentially it recognizes characters. So you can find OCR tools online to OCR some of that data so you don't have to retype all of it. If you have graphs that don't have labels, it may be very difficult to get that live data. It's always easiest to start from live data, but otherwise there will be kind of some manual entry. Once you have data, though, if you are working in Excel, there you can kind of move through graph types pretty easily to compare before you then finalize a graph for presentation. Optical character recognition. All right. That's what OCR stands for. Any others, Audrey?
Yes. I had somebody direct message me a question. What are some online resources we could use for creating charts and deciding what kind of charts to use for our data?
Okay, great. We actually just were talking about this internally, and I do have several that I've collected over the years. The first that pops into mind is Jonathan Schwabish. If you don't know him or follow him, he's wonderful, wonderful, wonderful at DataViz, and he's got I think his website's called the DataViz Project, and they've got a bunch of different graph types you can search by name to get kind of the sample of what that looks like. There's another that where you can search differently. You search by function. That's a great way to kind of discover new graphing expressions. I think that one's called the DataViz Catalog. But what I can do is put some of these in our follow-up email. You will receive an email from us that has the link to the recording and the blog post of this, along with I'll put some of these resources and answers to any of the other questions that we didn't get to, because I do think we are at time. But thank you so much, everybody, for showing up today. I hope to see you in a few months for Captivate and Engage. In the meantime, never hesitate to reach out to us. We are available at hello@sliderabbit.com. Thanks, everybody.